The company holiday party was already in full swing when Emily Carter finally pushed open the doors of the ballroom and stepped inside. Warm, golden lights reflected off crystal glasses. Music drifted lazily through the air, and the room buzzed with the loose, careless laughter of coworkers who had already had more than enough wine. Emily paused just inside the entrance for a moment, allowing her eyes to adjust as she scanned the crowded room for the small white place cards arranged on the tables. She was 20 minutes late, something she had been trying to avoid all evening, but life with a 7-year-old daughter rarely followed schedules the way corporate calendars expected it to. Her babysitter had arrived late. Lily had asked 3 more bedtime questions than usual, and by the time Emily finally left the house, she had already known she would be walking into the party after everyone else. Normally, she avoided events like this whenever possible. Office parties had a way of turning private lives into public entertainment, and as a single mother who preferred to keep her personal world quiet, Emily had learned that the safest strategy was distance. But attendance tonight had been strongly encouraged by management, and skipping it would have meant answering more questions than she was willing to face. So she straightened the sleeve of her dark dress, took a quiet breath, and stepped farther into the ballroom. Rows of round tables stretched across the polished floor, each decorated with white lilies in thin gold ribbon tied carefully around the vases. At the center of the room, the executive table stood slightly elevated, its arrangement larger and brighter than the rest. Waiters moved quickly between chairs, delivering drinks and appetizers, while the DJ tested the sound system with upbeat music that blended into the background noise of conversation. Emily walked slowly between tables, her eyes searching for the card with her name. When she finally spotted it near the middle of the room, something unusual happened. A ripple of suppressed laughter moved across the nearby tables like a quiet wave. A few people leaned toward one another and whispered behind their hands. Someone across the room raised an eyebrow and nudged the person beside them. Emily felt it immediately, that subtle shift in atmosphere that told her she had just stepped into something she had not been meant to notice yet. She reached the table and looked down at the place card again, hoping she had misunderstood. But the moment her eyes lifted to the seat beside it, she understood exactly what had happened. Sitting there already was Daniel Brooks. Daniel worked on the 4th floor in the analytics department. In 6 months at the company, Emily had barely heard him speak. He arrived exactly at 8 every morning, left precisely at 5 every evening, and spent most of his lunch breaks alone in the corner of the break room, reading something on his phone. His quietness had made him almost invisible to the rest of the staff, and over time, people had begun describing him with the casual cruelty that offices sometimes cultivate: boring, awkward, forgettable. Now he sat beside the empty chair reserved for her, his hands folded neatly on the table, his gray suit slightly loose at the shoulders, as if he had chosen comfort over fashion. He wasn't looking at anyone. His gaze rested somewhere past the centerpiece, calm and distant, as though the noise of the party existed in another world entirely. Emily felt the heat rise slowly along the back of her neck as she realized what her coworkers had done. Someone had deliberately placed her beside Daniel as a joke. From the table behind her came a whisper that wasn't quite quiet enough. Look, she found her seat. A second voice followed, barely containing a laugh. Perfect match, right? Emily didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The meaning was already clear. To them, the quiet man nobody paid attention to, and the single mother who rarely joined office gossip, were the ideal setup for a night of harmless entertainment. Emily pulled out the chair slowly and sat down, forcing her expression into polite neutrality, even as she felt the weight of curious eyes settling on her shoulders. Across the table, Daniel still hadn't reacted. If he had heard the whispers, he gave no sign. The laughter faded back into the music and conversation of the room, but Emily knew it hadn't disappeared. It had only moved into quieter corners where people could watch and wait to see what would happen next. She picked up the water glass in front of her and took a slow sip, pretending not to notice the occasional glance sent in their direction. For a moment, she considered saying something to Daniel, perhaps a simple greeting to ease the strange tension surrounding them. But every possible sentence felt wrong. Apologizing would confirm that the situation was humiliating. Ignoring it would make it seem like she accepted the joke. So she did the only thing she could think of. She stayed quiet and looked down at the menu card resting beside her plate, though she had no intention of ordering anything. Around them, the party continued, laughter rising, glasses clinking, music growing louder as the night warmed up. But at their table, the air felt different. It felt like the center of a story that the rest of the room had already decided was funny. And as Emily sat there beside the silent man everyone had chosen for the joke, she realized with sudden clarity that tonight she had not walked into a celebration. She had walked into a performance, and somehow she had become the punchline before the evening had even begun. At first, the laughter around Emily and Daniel's table faded back into the rhythm of the party, but it didn't truly disappear. It lingered in the background like a quiet current running beneath the music and conversation. Emily could feel it every time someone glanced in their direction and quickly looked away again. Every time two coworkers leaned toward each other with amused expressions before whispering something that ended in suppressed laughter. She tried to focus on the plate placed in front of her when the waiters began serving dinner, but the tension sitting on her shoulders made even the simple act of holding a fork feel strangely deliberate. Across the table, Daniel remained as still as he had been when she first sat down. He moved only occasionally, taking a sip of water or adjusting his napkin with calm precision. If the attention in the room bothered him, he gave no indication. Emily wondered if he had learned long ago how to disappear inside moments like this, the way some people mastered invisibility simply by refusing to react. The quiet lasted until someone from the sales department stood up with a wine glass in hand and decided the evening needed a little more entertainment. "Hey, Daniel," the man called out loudly enough for several nearby tables to hear. "You've been sitting next to Emily all this time and you haven't even said hello. What's wrong, man? Nervous?" A ripple of laughter rolled through the room. Emily felt the heat rush to her face instantly. She lowered her eyes to her plate and pushed a piece of chicken across it with her fork, even though she had no appetite. The man didn't stop there. "Come on," he added with exaggerated encouragement. "You're sitting next to the most beautiful woman in the room. At least introduce yourself." Someone else chimed in from a nearby table. "Yeah, Daniel, make your move. This is your chance." The comments were delivered with the tone people use when they believed they were being playful rather than cruel. But the effect was the same. Emily could feel every word pressing down on her like an invisible weight. She had spent the last 3 years rebuilding her life after her divorce, focusing on raising Lily, working hard, and keeping her personal world separate from the endless chatter of the office. That boundary had protected her from most of the gossip that circulated through the company, but tonight those walls felt fragile. The teasing grew louder as more people joined in. A woman from accounting leaned over from the table beside them with a smile that looked too polished to be sincere. "Emily, you should give Daniel a chance," she said in a voice that carried easily across the room. "You two are perfect for each other, both quiet, both single. It's practically destiny." Another burst of laughter followed. Someone else added with mock sympathy, "Honestly, Emily, dating is hard when you're a single mom. You can't afford to be too picky." Emily's grip tightened around her fork. The words were disguised as advice, but there was something sharp underneath them. A few people clapped lightly as if the remark had been particularly clever. Emily forced herself to breathe slowly and keep her expression neutral. Reacting would only make the moment worse. She had seen how these situations worked. If she protested, they would accuse her of being overly sensitive. If she laughed along, they would take that as permission to continue. The safest option was silence, even if silence meant absorbing the humiliation alone. She risked a glance at Daniel, curious whether he felt the same tension tightening around the table. His expression remained calm, almost distant, but something about his stillness seemed more deliberate now. It wasn't the awkward quietness of someone unsure what to say. It looked more like restraint, as if he had heard every word and simply chosen not to respond yet. Emily looked away again before he could catch her watching. Across the ballroom, the DJ switched songs, and the music grew louder. Some people drifted toward the dance floor, while others stayed at their tables, refilling glasses and continuing the conversation that now revolved openly around Emily. A younger woman from Human Resources passed their table and leaned down between them with theatrical enthusiasm. "You two look adorable together," she announced. "Seriously, it's like the universe knew exactly where to seat you." She winked at Emily and walked away before either of them could answer. The table behind them erupted in laughter again. Emily felt a knot tighten painfully in her chest. None of these people knew anything about her life beyond what they had pieced together through hallway conversations and casual assumptions. They didn't know about the nights she stayed awake worrying about Lily's future, the extra shifts she worked to make sure her daughter had everything she needed, or the quiet determination it had taken to rebuild her confidence after the end of her marriage. To them, she wasn't a colleague or even a person tonight. She was a storyline, something amusing to talk about while the wine kept flowing. She realized then that the jokes were not going to stop. They were growing, feeding off the attention of the room the way small sparks turn into flames when enough oxygen surrounds them. And sitting there beside Daniel Brooks, the man everyone had chosen for the punchline, Emily understood with painful clarity that her coworkers were not simply teasing her. They were turning her life into entertainment, and the entire room had decided it was perfectly acceptable to watch. The laughter did not stop. Even as the music grew louder and waiters continued moving between the tables with trays of drinks, the quiet focus of the room remained fixed on Emily and Daniel's table. Each new comment seemed to arrive just as the previous one faded, like waves breaking one after another on the same stretch of shore. Emily kept her eyes on the tablecloth, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of her plate, as if holding herself steady in place. For a few minutes, she told herself that if she stayed still long enough, the attention might drift somewhere else. Office parties had short memories when alcohol and gossip were involved. But tonight, the jokes had momentum, and once people sensed that she was uncomfortable, the temptation to push further only grew stronger. Someone from across the room called out another remark about how Daniel should finally ask her out. A different voice joked that Emily must be secretly grateful for the help because dating with a child was basically impossible. The words landed harder than the laughter that followed them. Emily felt the familiar pressure behind her ribs that appeared whenever someone reduced her life to a single label. Single mom, difficult schedule, complicated baggage. They said it casually, as if those words defined her entire identity. For 3 years, she had worked quietly to build stability for herself and her daughter Lily. She had balanced deadlines with bedtime stories, conference calls with school pickups, and the endless calculation of making sure there was always enough money, enough time, enough patience. Yet here, in the middle of a room filled with colleagues who barely knew her, that entire life had been flattened into a punchline. She realized suddenly that she could not sit there another minute. The weight of the room had become unbearable. Without saying anything, Emily placed her napkin on the table and pushed her chair back. The legs scraped across the polished floor louder than she intended, drawing several curious glances from nearby tables. For a moment, she hesitated, wondering if standing up would only feed the joke further, but staying would be worse. She picked up her purse and turned toward the exit at the far end of the ballroom. The laughter followed her like an echo as she walked. Someone clapped slowly. Another voice called her name in mock encouragement, suggesting she should take Daniel with her if she planned to leave early. Emily did not look back. She kept walking until the warm noise of the ballroom faded behind the heavy double doors. The hallway outside was quiet and cool compared to the heat of the party. The sudden silence felt almost shocking. Emily leaned briefly against the wall and closed her eyes, drawing in a slow breath that tasted faintly of polished wood and cold air from the ventilation system. Her heart was beating too fast. the embarrassment still burning under her skin. She hated that it affected her this much. She had faced far more difficult moments in her life than a room full of careless coworkers. Yet something about being laughed at in public by people who pretended to be friendly felt uniquely humiliating. Footsteps sounded behind her a few seconds later. Emily opened her eyes just as Daniel Brooks stepped through the ballroom doors and into the hallway. He moved at the same calm pace she had seen all evening, hands in his pockets, expression steady. He stopped a few feet away from her, leaving enough space that she did not feel cornered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them was different from the silence at the table earlier. It carried understanding instead of tension. Emily wondered if he had followed her because he felt obligated or because he simply needed to escape the room as well. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was low but clear in the empty hallway. They do this every year. Emily looked up at him, surprised. He nodded slightly as if confirming a fact he had already considered many times. Last year it was someone from the IT department. They paired him with a woman from payroll and spent the entire night making jokes about it. His tone was not bitter or angry. It sounded almost analytical, like someone describing a pattern that had become predictable. Emily folded her arms loosely across her chest, trying to process what he was saying. "And no one stopped them?" she asked quietly. Daniel shook his head once. He left the company 2 weeks later. The hallway fell silent again. Emily looked down at the floor, her thoughts moving quickly through the evening's events. She had assumed the humiliation was uniquely hers, that somehow she had invited the attention by simply showing up alone. Hearing Daniel describe it as a routine tradition changed something in her perspective. The problem was not her presence. The problem was the culture of the room she had walked into. She let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. "I should have known better than to come," she murmured. Daniel studied her for a moment before responding. "You should be able to attend a company event without being treated like entertainment." The simplicity of his statement surprised her more than any elaborate apology could have. He had not tried to comfort her with empty reassurance or pretend the jokes were harmless. He had simply acknowledged that what happened was wrong. For the first time that night, Emily felt a small portion of the tight knot in her chest begin to loosen. Standing there in the quiet hallway beside the man everyone in the ballroom had dismissed as insignificant, she realized she no longer felt completely alone. The quiet of the hallway did not last long. Emily had just begun to feel the tension in her chest loosen when the double doors behind them burst open again, releasing another wave of music, laughter, and voices from the ballroom. A man from the marketing department stumbled into the hallway holding a drink. His tie loosened and his face flushed from alcohol and excitement. He stopped when he saw Emily and Daniel standing there together. For a moment, his expression shifted from surprise to amusement, as though he had just discovered the final scene of a joke that had been building all evening. "Well, look at this," he said loudly, his grin widening. "You two actually ran off together." The words echoed down the hallway before Emily had time to react. The man leaned back through the open doors and shouted into the ballroom behind him. "Hey everyone, they're out here together." The effect was immediate. Within seconds, several curious faces appeared in the doorway, their expressions bright with anticipation. A woman from Human Resources leaned out first, her voice rising with exaggerated excitement. "Oh my God, did we interrupt something?" Someone else laughed and pushed the door wider, allowing more people to gather in the entrance. The hallway that had felt private only moments earlier now felt like a stage again. Emily felt the same hot embarrassment flood through her chest. She took a step backward, instinctively moving closer to the wall as the crowd grew larger. They weren't shouting insults exactly, but the teasing carried a sharper edge now that they had found the two of them alone together. A man near the door called out, "Don't stop on our account. We're all rooting for you." Another voice followed quickly behind it. "Yeah, Daniel, don't let her get away. You finally got your shot tonight." Laughter rippled through the small crowd. Emily's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. A few minutes earlier, she had hoped the hallway might offer a chance to breathe, a moment away from the humiliation of the party. Instead, the same cruelty had followed her outside like a shadow. The eyes watching her now were the same ones that had been laughing across the ballroom. The only difference was that here, in the narrow space of the hallway, she could see every one of them clearly. The mocking smiles, the raised eyebrows, the curiosity that turned other people's discomfort into something entertaining. Emily's first instinct was to leave immediately. She glanced down the hallway toward the side exit that led to the parking lot. If she walked quickly enough, she could reach her car in less than a minute. She would drive home, check on Lily, and pretend the entire night had never happened. But the crowd was growing larger by the second. More people were stepping through the doors, drawn by the promise of another round of jokes. Someone even began clapping slowly, as if encouraging the scene to continue. Emily felt the familiar sense of being cornered. Every direction seemed wrong. If she stayed, the humiliation would continue. If she left, it would confirm exactly what they wanted, that she had been embarrassed enough to run away. She swallowed hard and looked toward Daniel. He had not moved since the doors opened. His posture remained relaxed, his hands still resting in his pockets. But there was something different in his expression now, something thoughtful and focused that Emily had not seen before. He glanced briefly at the crowd gathering in the doorway, and then back at her. "They're hoping you leave," he said quietly. Emily blinked in surprise. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as though they were discussing something far less tense than the situation unfolding around them. "Why?" she asked. Daniel gave a small shrug. "Because then the story ends the way they want it to." Emily followed his gaze toward the doorway. The crowd was watching closely now, waiting to see what she would do. Some of them were whispering, others were smiling openly, enjoying the spectacle of the moment. Daniel tilted his head slightly toward the ballroom behind them. "If you want to go home," he continued, "I won't stop you." His tone carried no pressure, only quiet understanding. Then he added, "But if you leave now, they'll spend the next week telling everyone that they chased you out of the party." Emily felt the words settle slowly in her mind. He wasn't trying to persuade her for his own sake. He was simply pointing out the truth she had been too overwhelmed to recognize. The story was already being written in their heads. Running would only complete it. Daniel glanced again toward the ballroom and then back at her. "We could go back in," he said. Emily stared at him in disbelief. "Back in there?" He nodded once. "Not for them. For you." The noise from the doorway grew louder as someone shouted another teasing comment. Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, weighing the two choices in front of her. Leave and escape the humiliation tonight, or walk back into the room and face the same people who had been laughing at her all evening. When she opened her eyes again, Daniel was still standing there waiting calmly for her decision. And somehow, in that moment, the hallway didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like a crossroads. Emily didn't remember making the decision to walk back into the ballroom. One moment she had been standing in the hallway, surrounded by the murmuring crowd, and the next she was moving forward again with Daniel beside her. The same doors that had felt like an escape only minutes earlier, now opened to reveal the bright noise of the party waiting inside. Conversation slowed the moment people noticed them returning. Chairs shifted, heads turned. The atmosphere changed instantly, the way it does when a room senses that the story it has been watching is about to continue. Emily felt every pair of eyes follow her as she crossed the floor back toward their table. Her heart beat faster with each step, but she forced herself to keep her head up. The whispers started again, almost immediately. Someone near the bar laughed softly and nudged the person next to them. Another voice called out across the room, pretending to sound impressed. "Look at that, they came back." A man from the sales department raised his glass with a crooked grin. "See, I told you they were into each other." The laughter that followed carried the same careless cruelty that had been building all evening. Emily reached the table and sat down again, gripping the edge of the chair so tightly her fingers turned pale. She had known the jokes would continue, but hearing them return with the same energy made her chest tighten all over again. Around them, the room felt different now, quieter but heavier, as if everyone was waiting for something bigger to happen. A woman from accounting leaned back in her chair and spoke loudly enough for several tables to hear. "Emily, you really should give Daniel a chance," she said with a sugary smile. "Single moms can't afford to be too picky." A few people laughed. Another voice joined from across the room. "Yeah, come on. Daniel's right there. You're not getting any younger." The words landed like stones. Emily stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tightly it ached. She could feel the humiliation creeping up her neck again, the same helpless anger she had felt earlier in the evening. For a moment, she considered standing up and leaving for good this time. But before she could move, Daniel stood. The scrape of his chair against the floor cut cleanly through the laughter. It wasn't a loud sound, yet it carried across the room with unexpected force. Conversations faltered. A few people stopped mid-sentence and turned toward him. Emily looked up, confused by the sudden shift. Daniel reached down and gently took her hand. The gesture was simple, but steady, his fingers warm against hers. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected that. For a second, she was too stunned to react, but she didn't pull away. Daniel turned toward the room. His posture remained relaxed, but there was something unmistakably firm in the way he stood there beside her. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, yet it carried clearly across the ballroom. "That's enough." The words hung in the air like a sudden stop to the music. The laughter died almost instantly. A man named Greg from operations leaned back in his chair with a skeptical grin. "Whoa," he said. "Didn't know you had it in you, Daniel. What's going on? You defending her now?" His tone was still mocking, but the confidence behind it had weakened. Daniel met his gaze calmly. "Yes," he said simply, "I am." The directness of the answer unsettled the room more than any shouting could have. Greg gave a short laugh and gestured loosely around the tables. "Relax, man. We're just joking. It's a party." Daniel didn't move. He continued holding Emily's hand, his expression steady. "Turning someone's life into entertainment isn't a joke," he replied. The room grew quieter. Daniel looked around the ballroom slowly, meeting the faces of the people who had been laughing minutes earlier. "Emily came here tonight because she was invited," he continued. "She deserves to sit here without being treated like a punchline." The calm authority in his voice made several people shift uncomfortably in their seats. A woman from HR raised her hands defensively. "We didn't mean anything by it," she said quickly. "We were just trying to help her out." Daniel shook his head once. "No," he said, "you weren't helping." He paused briefly before finishing the thought. "You were being cruel." The word landed with unexpected weight. No one laughed this time. The room had grown so quiet that the faint hum of the sound system was suddenly noticeable. Greg opened his mouth to argue again, but the confidence was gone from his expression now. Around the room, people avoided looking directly at Daniel, as if recognizing something in his words that made the situation far less amusing than it had seemed before. Daniel finally released Emily's hand and took a small step forward. His voice remained calm, but the firmness behind it had only grown stronger. "You don't need to like someone to treat them with respect," he said, "and you certainly don't need to turn their personal life into a spectacle just because you think it's funny." Emily felt tears pressing at the corners of her eyes, but this time they weren't from embarrassment. For the first time that evening, someone had said out loud what she had been thinking all along. And as the room sat in stunned silence around them, she realized that the quiet man everyone had dismissed as forgettable had just changed the entire atmosphere of the party with nothing more than a few steady words. For several long seconds after Daniel finished speaking, no one in the ballroom moved. The laughter that had filled the room only moments earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by an uneasy silence that seemed to settle over every table at once. Emily could feel the shift in the air as clearly as if the temperature had dropped. People who had been joking loudly now avoided looking at each other. A few stared down at their drinks. Others watched Daniel with uncertain expressions, as though trying to understand how the quiet man they had ignored all evening had suddenly managed to command the entire room with a few calm sentences. Emily's hand was still resting on the edge of the table, her heart beating so loudly she could almost hear it. She had no idea what would happen next. Part of her expected someone to laugh again, to dismiss Daniel's words and return the party to its previous careless mood. But before anyone could speak, another voice cut through the silence from the front of the room. "Good evening, everyone." The words came through the speakers with the faint echo of a microphone being switched on. Every head turned toward the small stage near the dance floor, where the company's CEO, Robert Harris, had just stepped forward. The tall man adjusted the microphone calmly, glancing across the room with a measured expression that suggested he had heard far more of the situation than most people realized. He tapped the microphone once, the soft pop of the speaker drawing everyone's full attention. "I apologize for arriving late tonight," Robert continued, his voice smooth but firm. "But it seems I've come just in time to witness an interesting moment." A ripple of nervous movement passed through the crowd. No one laughed now. The CEO's gaze moved slowly across the room before settling briefly on Daniel. "Before we finish the evening," Robert said, "I'd like to invite someone to say a few words." He paused for a fraction of a second. "Daniel Brooks, would you come up here, please?" A wave of confused murmurs spread across the ballroom. Emily felt her stomach twist as she looked up at Daniel. She expected him to refuse, or at least hesitate. Instead, he simply released a quiet breath and stepped away from the table. His movements were unhurried, the same calm pace he had maintained all evening. Yet now every step toward the stage seemed to echo across the silent room. Conversations faded entirely as people watched him walk past their tables. Greg from operations leaned back in his chair, whispering something to the person beside him with a nervous half-smile that no longer looked confident. When Daniel reached the stage, Robert handed him the microphone and stepped slightly aside. Daniel stood there for a moment, looking out across the ballroom filled with the same coworkers who had been laughing minutes earlier. From her seat, Emily could see faces she recognized everywhere. People from accounting, marketing, sales, human resources, all of them waiting, uncertain now instead of amused. Daniel raised the microphone slowly. His voice, when it came, was clear and steady. "I've been working here for 6 months," he began. A few confused whispers rippled through the crowd. "Most of you don't know me," Daniel continued. "Some of you probably don't even remember my name." The statement carried no bitterness, only quiet honesty. He let the words settle before continuing. And that was intentional. The room grew even stiller. Emily felt a strange tension building in the air, as though something important was about to be revealed, but no one could quite see it yet. Daniel glanced briefly toward her table before returning his attention to the crowd. "I came here to understand how this company works from the inside," he said. "Not just the numbers or the reports, the culture, the way people treat each other when they believe no one important is watching." Several people shifted in their seats now, their expressions tightening. Daniel lowered the microphone slightly and handed it back to Robert. For a moment, Emily wondered if that was the end of his speech. But then the CEO stepped forward again, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the entire room listen carefully. "For those of you who may not know," Robert said, "Daniel Brooks is not simply one of our employees." The words seemed to hang in the air. "He is the founder of the parent company that acquired this organization 2 years ago." The effect was immediate. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom like a shockwave. Someone near the back dropped a glass, the sound of it shattering against the floor echoing sharply through the stunned silence. Emily sat frozen in her chair, staring toward the stage as the meaning of the words slowly settled into her mind. Daniel, the quiet analyst who sat alone at lunch, the man everyone had dismissed as forgettable, was the founder. For 6 months he had been walking through the same hallways, attending the same meetings, listening to the same conversations. In all that time, he had been observing everything. Around the room, the reactions were immediate and unmistakable. Greg's face had turned pale. The woman from accounting covered her mouth with her hand, as if trying to erase something she had said earlier. Others avoided looking at the stage entirely, their earlier confidence dissolving into uncomfortable silence. Robert stepped back again and handed the microphone to Daniel once more. This time when Daniel spoke, his voice carried not only calm, but unmistakable authority. "I didn't speak earlier because of my position," he said quietly. "I spoke because what happened tonight was wrong." His gaze moved across the room slowly, meeting the eyes of the people who had been laughing not long before. Respect shouldn't depend on who someone turns out to be. The silence that followed felt heavier than any speech could have been, and as Emily sat there trying to process everything she had just learned, she realized that the man who had defended her moments earlier had not done so because he had power. He had done it because he believed it was the right thing to do, even when no one in the room knew who he really was. The ballroom slowly emptied after the announcement, but the silence that followed Daniel's revelation lingered in the air long after most people had left. Conversations were hushed now, coats gathered quietly, chairs pushed back without the careless laughter that had filled the room earlier. The same coworkers who had been joking only an hour before now avoided looking at either Daniel or Emily as they passed by. Some muttered brief apologies. Others simply slipped out the doors as quickly as possible. Emily remained seated for a moment, her mind still trying to catch up with everything that had happened. Daniel Brooks, the quiet man who had sat beside her all evening without drawing attention to himself, was the founder of the company that owned the entire organization. Yet the truth that stayed with her most strongly was not his title or his power. It was the moment he had stood up for her before anyone knew who he really was. Daniel eventually walked back from the stage and returned to the table. The room around them was nearly empty now. A few waiters cleared glasses and folded napkins, while the music had already faded into silence. When Daniel sat down again, he looked almost exactly the same as he had earlier that evening, calm, composed, and quietly observant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily studied him carefully, trying to reconcile the man she had just learned about with the person she had been sitting beside for the last 2 hours. Finally, she broke the silence. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" she asked softly. Daniel considered the question before answering. "Because it wouldn't have changed the part that mattered," he said. His voice carried the same steady calm she had heard in the hallway. "What happened tonight was wrong, whether I was the founder or not." Emily felt a strange warmth move through her chest at the simplicity of his answer. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair before continuing. "I didn't defend you because I had authority over anyone in this room," he said. "I did it because I understood what it feels like." Emily frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. Daniel's expression softened just a little. "I'm a single parent too," he explained. "My son is 9. His name is Ryan." The words surprised her more than anything else he had said that night. Suddenly, small details she had noticed before made sense. The way he always left the office at exactly 5. The quiet routine he followed every day. The fact that he never stayed late for drinks with the rest of the team. "People make assumptions when you raise a child alone," Daniel continued. "They assume you're less committed to your work, less capable, less reliable." His tone remained calm, but Emily could hear the quiet weight behind it. "Most of the time, they don't even realize they're doing it." Emily nodded slowly. She understood that feeling too well. For 3 years, she had carried the invisible label of single mother everywhere she went. Sometimes it appeared as sympathy, other times it appeared as doubt, but almost always it came with judgment. "My daughter's name is Lily," she said quietly. "She's 7. A small smile appeared on Daniel's face. "Ryan is obsessed with dinosaurs right now," he said. "Every night he teaches me a new fact about the Cretaceous period." Emily laughed softly, the sound surprising both of them after the heaviness of the evening. Lily is the same with animals, she said. She asked me this morning why I was going to a party I didn't even want to attend. Daniel smiled a little wider. Kids tend to see things clearly. They stood up together and walked toward the exit as the last few employees finished leaving. Outside, the cold night air wrapped around them, carrying the quiet stillness of the empty parking lot. Emily's car sat beneath a flickering streetlight near the far edge of the lot. They walked side by side in comfortable silence for a few moments before she finally turned to him. "So what happens now?" she asked. Daniel looked up at the dark sky for a second, as if considering the question carefully. "At work," he said, "things are going to change. The culture here needs to improve." His voice carried quiet determination. "But real change takes time." Emily nodded. She understood that better than most people. Raising Lily alone had taught her that the most important changes in life rarely happen quickly. Then she hesitated before speaking again. "I didn't mean at work," she said. Daniel looked at her, slightly puzzled. Emily felt her face warm, but held his gaze. "I meant us." The word hung gently between them in the cool night air. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then a genuine smile appeared on his face, the first one she had seen that evening that reached his eyes completely. "I'd like to find out," he said, but slowly. He pulled out his phone and handed it to her. "Put your number in." Emily laughed quietly as she typed her contact into the screen. When she handed the phone back, Daniel sent her a message so she would have his number too. Her purse buzzed softly a second later. They stood there for another moment, neither of them quite ready to say goodbye. Finally, Emily opened the car door and paused before getting in. "Thank you," she said again. "For tonight." Daniel nodded. "Drive safe," he replied. "Text me when you get home." Emily started the engine and pulled out of the parking space. In the rearview mirror, she could still see Daniel standing beneath the streetlight, hands in his pockets, watching to make sure she left safely. 20 minutes later, after paying the babysitter and checking on Lily sleeping peacefully in her room, Emily lay down on her bed and finally allowed the exhaustion of the evening to settle over her. The party had begun with humiliation and laughter at her expense, but somehow it had ended with something entirely different. Someone had seen her. Someone had stood up for her. And as she closed her eyes, Emily realized that tonight had not only exposed the cruelty of a room full of people, it had quietly opened the door to something new, something hopeful, something neither of them had expected when the evening began.